The gaslight caught the sharp line of his jaw before she saw the rest of him. For a single, suspended moment, he was just a silhouette against the London evening, a tall man in a severe black coat, his stillness a rock in the river of pedestrians. Then he turned, and the illusion shattered. It was him, Duke Alistair Vance. A year had passed, a year that felt like a lifetime scraped out of dust and ashes, and he stood not 10 feet from her on the crowded pavement, his eyes, the same cool grey as a winter sea, fixed upon her. A jolt, sharp and painful as a physical blow, went through her. Elara felt the blood drain from her face, the warmth of the spring evening turning to ice on her skin. He looked unchanged. The same austere confidence, the same dark hair swept back from a high forehead, the same mouth that could press into a thin, unyielding line. It was the mouth she remembered from the last letter, the one that had dismissed her life with the flick of a pen. He took a half-step forward, his expression shifting from recognition to something she could not decipher, shock, perhaps, or something more complex. His lips parted as if to speak her name. In that instant, the world narrowed to the space between them. The noise of the carriages on the Strand, the cries of the newsboys, the scent of roasted chestnuts and damp coal smoke, it all faded into a dull roar. The girl he had known a year ago would have frozen. She would have flushed with shame or paled with remembered hurt. She might have burst into tears or offered a trembling, desperate curtsy. But that girl was gone, buried under a mountain of balanced ledgers, early mornings, and the quiet, fierce pride of self-sufficiency. Elara straightened her shoulders, the worn wool of her practical coat a comforting armor. She looked directly at him, through him, as if he were nothing more than a pane of glass. She saw the flicker of confusion in his eyes as her own gaze remained perfectly, icily blank. She did not acknowledge him. She did not slow her step. With the steady, unhurried pace of a woman with a purpose and a destination, she walked on. The crowd swallowed her, the distance between them growing with each step she took. She did not look back. She did not need to. She could feel the weight of his stare on her, a physical pressure, a question hanging unanswered in the thick London air. He had broken her heart, yes, but he had also, inadvertently, set her free. And she had no intention of ever returning to that cage, no matter how gilded its bars. The door to that life had closed, and she had been the one to bolt it. Subscribe for more stories like this. Let us know where you're watching from. A year before she walked past a duke on a London street, Elara Finch had been a ghost in her own home. She moved through the grand, decaying rooms of Blackwood Manor like a whisper, her presence essential but unacknowledged. Her father, Baron Finch, a man whose ambition had long outstripped his means, saw her not as a daughter, but as an asset, first a manager, then a commodity. It was Elara who kept the estate from crumbling entirely. In the small, cold office off the kitchens, long after the rest of the household slept, she was the one who wrestled with the ledgers, her fine, clear script tracing the slow, agonizing bleed of their finances. She renegotiated terms with suppliers, her letters so full of cool logic and irrefutable figures that merchants in the village grudgingly agreed to extend their credit. She managed the household accounts with a ruthless efficiency, stretching every shilling until it screamed, ensuring there was always food on the table, even as the tapestries frayed and damp crept up the walls. Her work was never mentioned. Her stepmother, a woman of brittle beauty and a soul of pure acid, considered any talk of trade or sums to be vulgar. She and her 2 daughters, Penelope and Beatrice, drifted through their days in a cloud of entitlement, their only occupations the selection of ribbons and the sharpening of cruel remarks aimed squarely at Elara. "So pale, Elara," her stepmother would observe, over a meagre breakfast of toast and tea that Elara herself had budgeted for. It is a pity the Duke prefers a bit of colour. You must try to look less like a governess." Penelope would giggle behind her hand. "She cannot help it, Mamma. Her mind is always on grocery bills. It drains the life from one's face." The Duke. For 6 months, Duke Alistair Vance had been the son her family's small, desperate world orbited. He was a neighbour, his own vast estate of Stonefell bordering their failing lands. He was powerful, solitary, and possessed of a fortune that could solve all of her father's problems. When he had begun to call at Blackwood, a startling and unprecedented event, the Baron had been ecstatic. And when the Duke's attention had settled, inexplicably, on Alara, the house had begun to hum with a frantic, hungry energy. Alara had allowed herself a fragile, tentative hope. Alistair did not speak to her of ribbons or gossip. He spoke to her of books, of politics, of the new crop rotation methods he was implementing at Stonefell. He looked at her as if he saw the mind behind her eyes, not just the pale face her stepmother lamented. In the library, their one true sanctuary, he would listen as she spoke, his gaze direct and serious. For the first time, she felt seen. She began to believe that love was not a transaction, that a future could be built on mutual respect. She fell in love with the quiet intensity in his eyes, with the startling, rare smile that transformed his severe features. The world, for a brief, shining time, seemed full of possibility. The end came without warning. There was no argument, no cooling of affections. One Tuesday, a footman from Stonefell delivered a letter on a silver tray. It was not for her, but for her father. Alara was arranging flowers in the hall when he read it. She watched the colour drain from his face, replaced by a mottled, apoplectic rage. He crumpled the thick parchment in his fist. "He's ended it," the Baron choked out, his voice thick with disbelief. The Duke, he withdraws his suit, no explanation, just concluded. He turned his furious gaze on Alara as if she were personally responsible for the collapse of his ambitions. "What did you do?" he snarled, advancing on her. "What did you say to drive him off?" Her stepmother and sisters appeared in the doorway, their expressions a sickening mixture of shock and triumphant malice. The sun had gone out. The cage door, which had seemed for a moment to be swinging open, was about to be slammed shut. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in domestic cruelty. The thin veil of tolerance her family had afforded her while she was the Duke's interest was ripped away, revealing the raw contempt beneath. She was no longer a potential duchess, but a failed investment, a constant irritating reminder of a lost fortune. Her stepmother's jibes became relentlessly cruel. "Such a shame," she would sigh at dinner, loud enough for the servants to hear. "To have a duke in your grasp and let him slip away. It speaks to a profound lack of charm. Or sense." Beatrice and Penelope took their cue from their mother, leaving clippings from the society pages on Alara's pillow, announcements of other, more successful betrothals, articles praising the beauty and grace of the season's debutantes. Her father ignored her entirely, his silence more damning than any tirade. He spent his days locked in his study with brandy and his ledgers, the ones Alara was no longer permitted to see. The house sank deeper into its genteel decay. The creditors, who had been held at bay by the prospect of a ducal son-in-law, began to circle once more. Their letters grew more frequent, their tone more demanding. Alara, confined to her room or to useless needlework in the parlour, felt the familiar weight of impending disaster settle over the house, but this time she was powerless to stop it. She was merely a passenger in a carriage careening toward a cliff. The final betrayal came on a rainy Thursday night. She was walking past her father's study when she heard raised voices. One was her father's, placating and desperate. The other was oily and familiar, a voice that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. Lord Fenwick. He was a man of 50 with a wet mouth and pale, acquisitive eyes, a notorious moneylender who had been circling the Finch estate for years. "The debt is long past due, Baron," Fenwick was saying, his voice oozing a false sympathy. "My patience has its limits." "Just a little more time, Fenwick," her father pleaded. The harvest will not be enough." Fenwick cut in smoothly. "However, I am prepared to offer you another solution, a permanent one. We have discussed it before." There was a pause. Alara pressed her ear to the heavy oak door, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Your eldest daughter," Fenwick continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial purr. "She is of age, unmarried, now that the Duke has come to his senses. A marriage contract between us would wipe the slate clean, all debts forgiven." A cold dread washed over Alara, so profound it made her feel faint. He was selling her. Her father was going to sell her to Lord Fenwick to settle his debts. "Alara?" her father stammered. She can be strong-willed." "I can manage a strong-willed woman." Fenwick chuckled, a low, predatory sound. "Consider it done, Baron. Have your lawyers draw up the papers." Alara backed away from the door, her hands trembling. She fled to her room, her mind racing. This was not a cage. It was a tomb. She would not be buried in it. That night she made her choice. Her one loyal ally in the house was Clara, a young housemaid whose quiet kindness had been a small beacon in the oppressive gloom. Alara sought her out in the kitchens. With a few whispered words, a shared look of understanding, a plan was made. While the house slept, Alara packed a small valise, one spare dress, her mother's locket, and the small stash of coins she had saved over the years, her pin money that she had never spent. Clara met her at the servants' entrance, pressing a bundle of bread and cheese into her hands. "Godspeed, Miss Alara," she whispered, her eyes shining with tears. Alara slipped out into the cold, wet darkness, a fugitive from her own life, with nothing but a handful of shillings and a desperate, burning will to survive. London was 100 miles away, a daunting, anonymous monster. But it was also a place to disappear, a place to become someone else entirely. Her arrival in London was less an arrival than a submersion. The city was a cacophony of sound and smell, a churning, overwhelming tide of humanity that threatened to sweep her away. For 2 days she drifted, staying in a cheap, noisy boarding house, eating stale bread and conserving every penny. The small handful of coins in her purse was shrinking at an alarming rate. She knew she needed to find work, and quickly. But what work was there for a disgraced baron's daughter with no references and no desire to be found? The usual avenues, a governess, a lady's companion, were closed to her. They required connections, introductions, a verifiable past. Her past was the very thing she was running from. She had one skill, the one her family had exploited and disdained. She understood numbers. She understood the intricate dance of assets and liabilities, the clean, cold logic of a balanced sheet. On her 3rd day, walking through a quieter street near Bloomsbury, she saw a sign in the window of a bookshop. It was a large, dignified establishment, its windows crowded with leather-bound volumes, the name, Hargrove's Antiquarian Books, painted in faded gold leaf above the door. The sign, written in a shaky hand, read, "Bookkeeper wanted. Inquire within." Taking a deep breath, Alara pushed open the heavy door. A small bell chimed. The air inside was cool and smelled of old paper, leather, and beeswax. Books were everywhere, stacked on tables, crammed into shelves that reached the high, shadowed ceiling. An elderly man with a fringe of white hair and spectacles perched on the end of his nose looked up from a large desk. This was Mr. Hargrove. He looked kindly, but overwhelmed. His desk was buried under teetering piles of invoices and receipts. "I am here about the position," Elara said, her voice steadier than she felt. Mr. Hargrove eyed her plain dress and tired face with skepticism. "Have you experience, miss?" "I have managed the accounts for a large country estate for the past 5 years," she said, editing the truth just enough. "I am proficient with ledgers, invoicing, and inventory management." He seemed unconvinced, but also desperate. He gestured to the mountain of paper on his desk. "Be my guest," he said with a sigh. For the next hour, Elara sat at a small table he cleared for her and began to work. She sorted the chaotic pile into categories: unpaid invoices from customers, overdue bills from publishers, shipping manifests, staff wages. Her mind, so long starved of a real problem to solve, lit up. She saw the patterns immediately, the inefficiencies, the small, bleeding wounds that were slowly draining the life from the business. After an hour, she presented Mr. Hargrove with a single sheet of paper on which she had written a neat summary of his financial situation and a 3-point plan to remedy it. He stared at the paper, then at her, his mouth slightly agape. He adjusted his spectacles. "Good heavens," he murmured. "You're hired, miss." "Finch," she said, choosing the simplest truth. Elara Finch. That was the beginning of her new life. She took a small, clean room above a bakery a few streets away. Her days were spent in the quiet, dusty world of Hargrove's. She was given a small office at the back of the shop, and there she created order out of chaos. She built a new system of accounting, her ledgers models of clarity and precision. She wrote polite but firm letters to customers with outstanding accounts. She renegotiated terms with his suppliers, just as she had for her father, but this time the work was hers. The credit was hers. Mr. Hargrove, freed from the burden of finances he clearly loathed, was able to focus on what he loved, acquiring and selling rare books. The shop began to thrive. Elara had found her place. She was no longer a ghost. She was Miss Finch, the indispensable manager of Hargrove's, a woman defined not by her name or her past, but by her competence. A year bled into the next, the seasons turning outside the dusty windows of the bookshop. Elara's life settled into a rhythm that was steady, quiet, and entirely her own. She rose with the sun, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery below her flat a constant, comforting presence. Her days were filled with the satisfying logic of numbers and the gentle rustle of turning pages. The 2 young men who worked as clerks at Hargrove's, initially wary of this serious, focused woman, had come to rely on her completely, treating her with a deep and genuine respect. Mr. Hargrove called her his miracle. She had saved his business, and in doing so, she had saved herself. She had built a small, solid fortress of a life, walled with independence and mortared with self-respect. The memory of Duke Alistair Vance had not vanished, but it had receded, becoming a scar rather than an open wound, a place that ached when the weather turned, but which no longer had the power to cripple her. The sharp, consuming pain of his rejection had dulled into a kind of weary resignation. He belonged to another world, another life, one she had been brutally ejected from. She had mourned the girl who had loved him, and then she had buried her. Then came the evening on the Strand. When she saw him, the shock was profound, a seismic tremor beneath the foundations of her carefully constructed peace. But as she walked past him, feeling the heat of his gaze on her back, the tremor subsided. It was not strength that carried her forward without a backward glance. It was certainty. Looking back was not an option. That path led only to ruin. He did not give up. 2 days later, a boy delivered a note to the bookshop. The envelope was thick, expensive cream parchment, the address written in a strong, familiar hand. Her heart gave a painful lurch. She took the note, said a quiet "thank you" to the boy, and without opening it, dropped it into the small stove in her office. The paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash. The next day another arrived. It met the same fate. He began to appear across the street from the shop, standing for long stretches, simply watching. He made no move to approach, no attempt to enter. He just watched, a silent, imposing figure against the backdrop of London life. Alara trained herself not to look, to feel his presence as nothing more than a change in the air, a pressure she could ignore. She did not understand what he wanted, and she did not care to. Whatever game he was playing, she would not be a pawn. Her life was her own now. It was small, perhaps, but it was hers, and she would protect it with everything she had. He finally broke the stalemate a week later. He did not come to the shop. He waited for her as she walked home, stepping out from the shadow of an alleyway just as she passed. She stopped, her hand flying to her throat, a gasp escaping her lips before she could suppress it. It was him, close enough to touch. "Miss Finch," he said. His voice was low, devoid of the warmth she remembered. It was the voice of a man stating a fact. "I apologize for the intrusion. My notes have apparently failed to reach you." "They reached me," she said, her own voice cold and clipped. "I had no interest in their contents. Please let me pass, Your Grace." "I cannot do that," he said, his expression unreadable in the deepening twilight. He was not pleading or apologizing. He was assessing. "I am not here to revisit the past. I am here to offer you a business proposition." The words were so unexpected, she could only stare at him. "A business proposition?" "Yes," he said. He reached into his coat and produced a slim leather portfolio. "I have spent the last year investigating a conspiracy, a network of financial fraud and treason that reaches into the highest levels of government. The man at its center is Lord Fenwick." He paused, letting the name hang in the air between them. Her blood ran cold. "I know what your father planned," Alistair continued, his grey eyes fixed on hers. "I know he intended to sell you to Fenwick to cover his debts. What you do not know is why I ended our courtship." He opened the portfolio. Inside were documents, letters. "Your father and Fenwick were partners. They had a scheme to use my name, my fortune, and our marriage to secure fraudulent government contracts. It would have ruined me and implicated me in their treason. I discovered it a year ago. The letter I sent your father was not an act of cruelty toward you, but a desperate, clumsy attempt to sever you from him, to protect you from the fallout I knew was coming. I believed he would simply cast you out. I never imagined he would try to hand you directly to the man who was orchestrating his ruin." The world tilted on its axis. Every memory, every certainty she had held for the past year, fractured. The cold, heartless Duke was protecting her? The story was so outlandish, yet it fit the pieces of the puzzle with a terrifying precision. "Why are you telling me this now?" she whispered. "Because Fenwick is a threat to the crown," he said plainly. "And I need your help to stop him. I have followed your progress this past year. I know what you have done for Hargroves. I have seen your work. You have a mind that sees patterns others miss. I do not need the Baron's daughter I once courted. I need Miss Alara Finch, the brilliant bookkeeper. I want to hire you. The terms are simple. A generous salary, my complete protection, and access to all the evidence I have gathered. In return, you will help me unravel Fenwick's accounts and expose him. It is a professional arrangement. Nothing more." He held out the portfolio. The air crackled with the weight of her choice. Trust the man who broke her heart, or turn away and remain safe in the small world she had built. But with a man like Fenwick aware of her existence, she knew, with a sinking finality, that she was no longer safe at all. Elara's acceptance was quiet, conditional. She did not move into his grand London townhouse, but agreed to work from its library during the evenings, after her duties at the bookshop were complete. The arrangement was as sterile and professional as he had promised. Each evening, a closed carriage, its curtains drawn, would collect her from a discreet corner near Hargrove's. She would be shown into the vast, silent library where Alistair would be waiting. He would have documents laid out on the massive mahogany table, shipping ledgers, bank statements, forged letters of credit, all connected to Lord Fenwick's sprawling, corrupt enterprises. They worked for hours in a focused, almost monastic silence, broken only by the rustle of paper, the scratch of her pen, and her occasional quiet questions. He would answer in the same clipped, factual tone. There were no personal overtures, no attempts to bridge the chasm of the past year. He treated her as he would any valued expert, with a cool, distant respect. And yet an odd intimacy began to grow in that shared silence, an intimacy born of a shared purpose. She saw a side of him she had never known, the tireless, methodical investigator, a man driven by a fierce, cold anger against the corruption that threatened the nation he served. He, in turn, watched her work, his gaze often lingering on her face as she bent over the ledgers, her brow furrowed in concentration. He saw the quickness of her mind, the way she could distill a mountain of chaos into a single, elegant thread of logic. He was not watching the girl he had lost, but the woman she had become. The external threat, when it came, was as brutally direct as Fenwick himself. He had learned of her association with the Duke. His network of spies was as extensive as his greed. One afternoon, as Elara was leaving the bookshop, he was simply there, blocking her path. His carriage, ostentatious and black, waited at the curb. He smiled, that wet, predatory smile she remembered from her father's study. "Miss Finch," he said, his voice a low purr of possession. "Or should I still call you Elara? We never were properly introduced, though I feel I know you so well." Elara stood her ground, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "I have no business with you, my lord." "Oh, I think you do," he countered, stepping closer. "Your father and I had an arrangement. A contract. You seem to have forgotten your obligations." His eyes, pale and depthless, raked over her. "The Duke is a dangerous man, my dear. He is playing a game far above your station. I am here to take you away from all this, to protect you, as is my right." "You have no rights where I am concerned," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "Don't I?" He reached out as if to take her arm. Before his fingers could touch her sleeve, another hand shot out, catching his wrist in an iron grip. Alistair. He had appeared as silently as a shadow, his face a mask of cold fury. "Lord Fenwick," Alistair said, his voice dangerously soft. "You will remove your hand, and you will not address Miss Finch again." Fenwick snatched his wrist back, his face flushing a blotchy red. "Vance, this is a private matter. A family arrangement." It was then that Elara found her voice, clear and strong, cutting through the tension. She stepped forward, positioning herself beside Alistair, not behind him. She looked directly into Fenwick's cruel eyes. "I am not property, Lord Fenwick. I am not my father's to sell, and I am certainly not yours to claim. I am in the Duke's employ by my own choice. You will leave me be, or you will find that my mind for numbers extends to calculating the precise legal consequences of harassment." The threat, so specific and unexpected, seemed to momentarily stun Fenwick. He stared at her, then at the Duke's unyielding expression. He knew he was beaten, for now. With a final venomous glare, he turned on his heel and climbed into his carriage. As it pulled away, Alistair turned to Alara. The fury in his eyes had been replaced by something else, something that looked almost like awe. They were no longer just a man and a woman with a broken past, or an employer and his expert consultant. They were allies, and they had just won their first battle together. The confrontation with Fenwick changed the atmosphere in the library. The professional distance remained, but it was now threaded with an unspoken solidarity. They were a team, bound by a common enemy and a shared secret. Their work intensified, fueled by a new sense of urgency. They knew Fenwick would not remain idle. They worked later and later into the night, the world outside the tall library windows fading away, leaving only the two of them, the piles of paper, and the warm glow of the oil lamps. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday, nearly a month after Alara had begun. She had been staring at a shipping ledger from one of Fenwick's trading companies for hours, a nagging sense of wrongness prickling at her. The cargo weights were all plausible, the customs duties all paid. But there was a subtle variance in the numbers, a ghost of a pattern she couldn't quite grasp. She asked Alistair for the company's wage books, a request he fulfilled without question. She cross-referenced the dates of the shipments with the pay records for the dock foreman. And there it was. "He's paying them twice," she whispered, her voice filled with the thrill of discovery. On the dates of these specific shipments, the foreman received their weekly wage, and then a second identical payment coded as a portage bonus. But the bonus is only paid when the cargo is French silk, Belgian lace, or Spanish wine. She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "He's not smuggling goods in. He's smuggling gold out. The declared cargo is a fiction. The crates are filled with sovereign gold, paid to enemies of the crown. The numbers in the shipping ledger aren't weights. They're coded references to the amount of gold in each crate." It was the key, the irrefutable proof of treason. Alistair stared at her, the final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the crackle of the fire. The case was made. The danger for the nation was over. But the tension between them, so long held in check, suddenly filled the vacuum. He did not look at the papers. He looked at her. The cool, guarded mask he wore had slipped, revealing the man beneath, a man who looked tired and vulnerable, and full of a profound regret. "I was a fool," he said, his voice quiet and rough. "A year ago I saw the threat, and my first instinct was to build a wall. I thought pushing you away was the only way to protect you. I should have trusted you. I should have come to you, laid these papers on the table, and asked you to stand with me then." The honesty of it stole her breath. She looked at the man across the table, a man she had loved, then hated, then worked alongside, and saw him clearly for the first time. "I would have," she said softly. "I would have stood with you." "I know," he said, and the simple acknowledgment was more devastating than any grand apology. The space between them seemed to shrink, charged with all the unspoken words of the past year. He slowly reached his hand across the wide mahogany table, his fingers uncurling. It was an offering, a question. After a heartbeat's hesitation, she placed her own hand in his. His skin was warm, his grip firm and sure. It was not the touch of a duke to a bookkeeper. It was the touch of a man reaching for his anchor in a storm. "I never stopped thinking of you, Alara," he confessed, his thumb tracing a slow circle on the back of her hand. "Not for a single day." In the quiet of the library, with the evidence of treason lying forgotten between them, a different, more fragile truth was finally being brought into the light. With the evidence secure, the final act had to be played out in public. Alistair's plan was audacious: to expose Fenwick not in a quiet office or a courtroom, but in the heart of society, where reputation was currency and humiliation was a mortal wound. The opportunity was a grand gala hosted by the Home Secretary at Lancaster House, an event Fenwick, in his arrogance, would never dream of missing. The authorities had been alerted. Officers would be waiting for Alistair's signal. The night of the ball, Alistair's carriage arrived for Alara not at a discreet corner, but at the front door of the bookshop. He stepped out and offered her his hand. She was no longer the woman in the practical wool coat. She wore a gown of deep midnight silk, a colour that mirrored the new, quiet confidence in her eyes. It had been a gift from Alistair, delivered with a simple note. For my partner. She had accepted it not as a favour, but as the uniform for the battle ahead. Entering the ballroom on his arm was like stepping onto a stage. A wave of whispers followed them, a rustle of speculation rippling through the glittering assembly. Alara held her head high, her hand resting lightly on Alistair's arm. She could feel the stares, the judgments. They saw a disgraced country girl who had somehow ensnared a duke. They did not see the woman who had brought down a traitor. Fenwick was holding court near the grand staircase, smug and resplendent in his evening attire. When he saw them, his eyes narrowed, and a cruel, triumphant smirk crossed his face. He began to move toward them, clearly intending to force a public confrontation, to claim her and humiliate them both. But Alistair was quicker. He guided Alara directly toward their host, the Home Secretary, a powerful man with a perpetually worried expression. Before Fenwick could intercept them, Alistair spoke, his voice clear and carrying, silencing the conversations around them. "Minister," he said, his tone commanding attention, "I would like to present my associate, Miss Alara Finch." The minister looked from the formidable Duke to the unknown young woman beside him, his expression one of polite confusion. Alistair did not release Alara's arm. Instead, his grip tightened in support. "It is through Miss Finch's singular genius," he announced, his voice ringing with conviction, "her unparalleled ability to decipher the most complex and deceitful accounts, that we have uncovered a conspiracy of treason against the crown. The architect of that conspiracy stands among us tonight." He turned his head slightly, his cold gaze pinning Lord Fenwick where he stood, frozen halfway across the room. "The evidence she unearthed is irrefutable. Lord Fenwick has been using his trading companies to funnel gold to Britain's enemies." A collective gasp went through the ballroom. Every eye swung from Alistair and Alara to the now pale Fenwick. The whispers ceased, replaced by a stunned, absolute silence. Alara stood tall, meeting the sea of shocked faces without flinching. Alistair had not rescued her. He had not hidden her. He had stood beside her in the brightest light and named her value for all the world to hear. At that precise moment, as if on cue, a dozen men in the plain, dark uniforms of the Crown's officers entered the ballroom. They moved with quiet efficiency through the stunned crowd, converging on Lord Fenwick. The game was over. As he was led away, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, the minister turned to Alara, his expression one of profound awe and gratitude. The whispers began again, but this time they were not of scandal, but of a mysterious, brilliant heroine. Alistair met Alara's eyes over the heads of the crowd, and in his gaze she saw not just victory, but a deep, abiding respect that was worth more than all the jewels in the room. Together they turned and walked out of the ballroom, leaving the glittering world of society to marvel at the truth. 3 months later, the dust had settled. Lord Fenwick was imprisoned, his network dismantled. The name Alara Finch had been whispered with reverence in the halls of power, though she herself had retreated from the glare of public life as quickly as she had entered it. She had returned to her quiet world of books and ledgers, but that world was no longer small. Alistair had purchased the building adjacent to Hargrove's, a former solicitor's office that had fallen into disuse. For weeks, it had been a hive of activity, architects, builders, and carpenters transforming the space. Now, it was complete. The wall between the two buildings had been removed, creating one vast, magnificent space. It was a cathedral of books, with soaring shelves, rolling ladders, comfortable reading chairs, and a glass ceiling that flooded the room with natural light. It was both Hargrove's antiquarian books and something new, the Vance and Finch Lending Library and Bookshop. Elara was not an employee. She was a proprietor, a full partner. It was their space, a world they had built together. One evening, long after the last customer had departed, they stood together in the quiet heart of their creation. The setting sun cast long, golden shafts of light through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The scent of old paper and new wood was the smell of home. Alistair turned to her, his face serious in the warm light. "I broke a contract once, Elara," he said softly, the unspoken one between us. "I was driven by fear, and I was wrong." He took her hands in his touch gentle but firm. "I would like to make a new one, a contract for life, bound not by law or business but by choice." He looked into her eyes, his own grey eyes clear and filled with a feeling he no longer tried to hide. "I am not offering you protection, or a position, or even a partnership in a bookshop. I am offering you all that I am. What began as my greatest regret has become my greatest blessing. You have shown me what it is to trust, what it is to build something together. Elara Finch, will you marry me?" A slow, radiant smile spread across her face. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated joy, a smile he had not seen in over a year, and he knew he would spend the rest of his life earning it. "Yes," she said, her voice full of certainty. "Yes, Alistair, I will." He slid a simple, elegant ring onto her finger. The final image was not of a duke and his duchess, but of two partners, two allies, standing in the quiet of the library they had built, their hands linked, surrounded by the silent, waiting stories and the beautiful, ordered piece of the life they would write together. What was broken had been made whole. What was transactional had become true. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Would you have forgiven him? Let us know your thoughts and where you're watching from in the comments below. The best alliances, after all, often begin when we dare to trust a second time.